Imagine waking up one day to discover that everything you thought you understood about fairness, justice, and meaning has fractured into shards that no longer fit together, as if the world itself has betrayed you. Because a friend you admired for their kindness is suddenly diagnosed with a merciless illness, or because the person you love most becomes the victim of a senseless accident, or because you read yet again about atrocities where those who harm seem to flourish while those who give seem to bleed. The mind struggles to reconcile this paradox, yet it cannot stop circling it like a moth pulled toward a flame, whispering in dread, "Why do bad things happen to good people?" A question that is not just theological or philosophical, but deeply personal, gnawing at the very foundations of what we believe about morality, causality, and our own place in the vast machinery of existence. For if the universe has any order at all, should not goodness be rewarded and malice punished? And yet every story told by reality suggests the opposite, that cruelty often triumphs and virtue is crucified, that the meek inherit not the earth but sorrow, and this contradiction presses against the psyche until it becomes unbearable, like staring too long into a mirror that distorts rather than reflects. You tell yourself there must be a reason, some hidden equation balancing suffering with growth. But then you remember the faces of children caught in wars they did not choose, the gentle souls broken by systems too indifferent to notice them, and the question turns sharper. If goodness does not shield us, if morality offers no armor, then what is the point of striving to be good at all? And yet to abandon goodness feels like a betrayal of something deeper than survival, a betrayal of the self that longs for integrity even in the face of chaos. So you stand at a precipice where every answer you reach for dissolves in your hands, leaving only more questions, more darkness, and a silence that echoes louder than any truth. Perhaps the unsettling possibility is that the universe is not built on fairness, but on indifference. That existence unfolds like a storm without concern for who it drenches or drowns, and if that is true, then we are left not with the comfort of justice, but the terror of meaninglessness. The idea that suffering has no inherent purpose at all. And yet, paradoxically, it is precisely this abyss of uncertainty that stirs something restless inside you. Some primal need to ask, to search, to demand answers from a reality that may never yield them. Because to stop asking would be to admit that nothing matters. And if nothing matters, then why do we ache so profoundly when goodness is punished? Why do we still recoil when innocence is shattered? Why does the human heart refuse to become as indifferent as the cosmos it inhabits? Perhaps the real torment is not suffering itself, but the inability to reconcile it with our sense of moral order. The way our consciousness insists on finding patterns, reasons, narratives, when the fabric of existence may hold none. And here you find yourself trapped in a strange and terrible tension. To be human is to need meaning. Yet the world offers us chaos, to desire fairness. Yet the world offers us cruelty, to long for answers. Yet the world answers only with silence. And in this silence arises the most urgent of all questions, not whether bad things happen to good people, but whether we can bear to live in a world where they do, whether we can continue to love, to hope, to act with integrity, even when every evidence suggests we are abandoned, unseen or punished precisely for our goodness. And this leads us inexorably toward the next unsettling revelation. For if the paradox cannot be resolved by clinging to easy notions of fairness, then perhaps the real issue lies elsewhere, in some hidden root within the psyche or the structure of society itself, a place we have not yet dared to look. a force beneath the surface that explains why our suffering feels both inevitable and intolerable. And to uncover it, we must descend into the depths of psychology, philosophy, and the unspoken truths that shape human existence. The question lingers like smoke in a room with no windows, and the more you try to wave it away, the thicker it becomes, until you realize it is not simply about the apparent injustice of suffering, but about something deeper, something woven into the very architecture of the human psyche. For it is not merely that bad things happen to good people, but that our minds cannot accept this truth without resistance, as though there is an ancient script written into our bones insisting that goodness must lead to safety and wickedness must lead to ruin. Yet reality constantly tears this script apart, leaving us with fragments that we keep trying to assemble into a coherent story. Psychologists like Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, that hidden part of ourselves where everything disowned and denied collects. And perhaps part of our torment lies in this refusal to acknowledge the shadow, not just in individuals, but in the world itself. The unspoken recognition that suffering is not an aberration, but an inevitability. And yet we recoil from this, because to accept it feels like surrendering to despair. So we cling to illusions of control, believing that if we live purely enough, selflessly enough, virtuously enough, the universe will reward us. But this is less a reflection of truth and more a coping mechanism rooted in the same instincts that once made us see gods in thunderstorms and curses in plagues. It is a psychological survival mechanism, a story we tell ourselves to make chaos tolerable, and when chaos shatters that story, we feel not only pain but betrayal, as though existence itself has deceived us. Consider the cultural myths passed down through generations, from ancient karma doctrines to the Western belief in divine providence, from childhood lessons that good behavior earns praise while bad behavior brings punishment, to the cinematic arcs where heroes triumph and villains fall. These narratives condition us to believe in a moral symmetry that reality does not honor. And so, when suffering strikes the innocent, it not only wounds the body, but also ruptures the very framework through which we interpret life, producing a deeper psychological wound, the wound of senselessness. Modern psychology has its own way of describing this. Cognitive dissonance, the unbearable gap between our internal model of how life should work and the brutal evidence of how it does, and our minds scramble to close this gap through rationalizations. Perhaps the person wasn't as good as they seemed. Perhaps there's a lesson hidden here. Perhaps fate has a plan. But these explanations often ring hollow, masking our helplessness with thin veils of meaning, and beneath them, a darker truth lurks, that much of human suffering has no reason, no moral logic, no guiding hand. Yet even as we edge toward this realization, something within us resists, because we fear that to admit suffering is meaningless is to rob our lives of significance altogether. So we invent gods, systems, philosophies that insist otherwise, not because they are necessarily true, but because without them the abyss yawns too wide. The philosopher Albert Camus spoke of the absurd, the tension between our desire for meaning and the world's silence. And it is within this tension that the hidden problem lies. The psychological need for fairness colliding with the indifferent reality of existence, producing a fracture in consciousness that feels unbearable. And yet, perhaps the problem is not only external but internal. For if we look closely, we see that even within ourselves, suffering arises not simply from what happens to us, but from our interpretation of it, the stories we attach, the judgments we cast, the expectations we nurse, and so suffering becomes amplified by the very structure of human thought, by our longing for certainty in a universe that denies it. We carry within us a deep-seated belief, inherited from evolution and reinforced by culture, that the world is controllable, predictable, governable by cause and effect, reward and punishment. Yet this belief is not truth but adaptation, a way to navigate uncertainty, and when that adaptation collides with reality, it shatters. The hidden problem, then, is not simply that bad things happen to good people, but that the human mind is constructed to see this as intolerable, to resist it at every level, to demand a fairness the world does not provide, and so our suffering becomes doubled, the event itself, and then the anguish of trying to reconcile it with our desperate need for order. This is why tragedies linger in memory long after wounds should have healed, why injustice haunts our nights and corrodes our days, because they are not merely experiences but violations of the deep-seated architecture of our beliefs. We cannot help but replay them, not out of masochism, but because our minds are still searching for an explanation that will restore equilibrium. And when none comes, we spiral deeper, pulled into the gravity of the unanswered question. And here lies the philosophical root. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures trapped in a world that does not guarantee meaning. And so we invent gods, moral laws, universal balances. Yet every disaster that befalls the innocent erodes these inventions until we are forced to confront the possibility that they are fragile constructions, not eternal truths. Nietzsche, with his relentless gaze, warned of this when he proclaimed the death of God, not merely the end of a deity, but the collapse of the metaphysical scaffolding that gave suffering a purpose, and with this collapse comes the terrifying freedom of confronting reality without illusions. But who among us is ready for that? Who among us can stare into chaos without flinching, without the instinct to explain, to justify, to assign blame? The hidden problem is not simply suffering, but our refusal to accept its randomness, our need to impose order upon what is not ordered, our craving for symmetry in a universe that thrives on asymmetry. And as long as this craving persists, suffering will always feel like a violation rather than a fact. Yet perhaps, even more unsettling, this craving is not an error, but an inevitable feature of consciousness itself. For without it, we might never have built civilizations, religions, or philosophies at all. And so the very force that gives us art, morality, and meaning also condemns us to torment when reality fails to conform. The problem is inside us and outside us, personal and universal, psychological and philosophical. And as we trace its contours, we begin to sense the weight of what it means, that our lives are shaped not only by what happens, but by the tension between what is and what we demand it should be. And this tension, left unresolved, becomes the ground from which all further consequences will emerge. Consequences that seep into every aspect of existence, shaping societies, relationships, and the very core of human identity. And so the consequences unfold, not like a sudden eruption, but like a slow, relentless tide that seeps into every crevice of human existence, altering the way we think, act, and build our societies. For when the gap between what we expect and what reality delivers grows too wide, it does not remain confined to a single wound, becomes an atmosphere, a lens through which all of life is filtered. And this is why so many people, often without realizing it, live in a quiet state of disillusionment, carrying a subtle bitterness beneath their smiles. Because at some level they have witnessed the collapse of fairness and never truly recovered from it. And this hidden scar influences everything, from the way we love to the way we trust, from the way we raise children to the way we construct entire civilizations. For if the world cannot be trusted to honor goodness, then suspicion becomes our default posture, cynicism becomes a shield, and even the noblest acts are questioned for hidden motives. This erosion of trust does not only poison individuals, but corrodes the very fabric of communities, creating cultures of competition, defensiveness, and alienation. And it happens slowly, imperceptibly, until one day we wake up to realize that we live in a society where compassion is seen as weakness, where vulnerability is mocked, where the ones who rise are often those who have shed integrity to climb. And though we protest against such outcomes, deep down we feel an almost gravitational pull toward resignation, as if to say, this is simply how the world works. Neurologically, this resignation embeds itself into the brain, carving pathways of learned helplessness, the phenomenon where repeated experiences of powerlessness condition us to stop trying, even when opportunities for change exist. And this becomes the silent epidemic of our age, not just depression or anxiety in their clinical forms, but a pervasive paralysis of the spirit, a dulling of the flame that once sought to make sense of suffering and instead settles into numb endurance. And in this numbness, the danger is greatest, for when we cease to search for meaning, we become easy prey to ideologies, advertisements, and systems that promise false comfort, filling the void with distractions, consumption, or dogmas that prevent us from ever truly confronting the underlying fracture. Cognitive biases deepen this trap, the just world hypothesis, which whispers to us that people must get what they deserve. So when they don't, we twist reality to preserve the illusion, blaming victims for their misfortunes, convincing ourselves that their suffering must be due to hidden flaws, because it is less terrifying to believe in secret justice than to admit there may be none. Confirmation bias, which filters the chaos of events until we see only the patterns that soothe us, ignoring the evidence that contradicts them. And the negativity bias, which ensures that every instance of unjust suffering burns itself into memory more deeply than any moment of joy, so that over time the world itself seems darker than it truly is, and hope feels like naivety. These unseen psychological forces shape not only individuals, but entire eras. Think of societies that, wounded by collective trauma, turn inward, growing authoritarian out of fear, or lash outward, seeking scapegoats to blame for their suffering. Think of religions that promise paradise only after unbearable trials, systems that normalize suffering as a necessary step toward transcendence. Think of economies built on exploitation that justify their cruelty by implying that the poor must somehow deserve their plight. In every case, the hidden fracture between our yearning for justice and reality's indifference creates a space where manipulation flourishes, where leaders, corporations, and dogmas exploit our desperation for meaning, promising order in exchange for obedience, comfort in exchange for conformity, distraction in exchange for silence. The personal consequence mirrors the societal one. Lives lived cautiously, hearts half closed, dreams diminished not by lack of talent, but by the silent weight of disillusionment, until entire generations grow up carrying the implicit belief that goodness is not enough, that life cannot be trusted, that one must armor the soul against inevitable betrayal. And in this way, the question of why bad things happen to good people is not merely philosophical but existentially urgent, because it shapes the choices we make each day, determining whether we lean toward fear or courage, toward bitterness or compassion, toward paralysis or rebellion. Yet beneath this heavy realization lies an even more unsettling truth, that perhaps the very suffering we resist is also the birthplace of transformation. For if we look carefully, history and psychology alike reveal that it is often those touched most deeply by undeserved suffering who become the carriers of wisdom, empathy, and resilience, not because suffering itself is noble or just, but because it strips away illusions and forces us to see with clarity what comfort and ease often obscure. The paradox is that while suffering destroys, it also awakens, and the choice each of us faces is whether we will let it corrode us into despair or transmute it into a deeper strength. This is not a comforting truth, nor an easy one, for it requires us to stop waiting for the world to be fair and instead confront the abyss directly, to abandon the hope that goodness guarantees safety and instead cultivate a goodness that persists without promise of reward, a goodness born not from expectation but from defiance, from the radical decision to act with integrity in a universe that may never acknowledge it. To live this way is to rebel against the tyranny of indifference, to declare that even if the cosmos is silent, we will not be, that even if cruelty often wins, we will not let cruelty dictate our own becoming, that even if bad things happen to good people, we will not let that truth silence our goodness, but instead make it fiercer, deeper, more unconditional. And perhaps this is the ultimate realization, that the question, why do bad things happen to good people, has no answer that satisfies the intellect, but it has a challenge that transforms the soul. Will you allow the randomness of suffering to harden you into bitterness, or will you allow it to carve you into someone who embodies the very goodness the world fails to guarantee? The choice is terrifying, because it places the burden back upon us, stripping away illusions of fairness and revealing that meaning is not given but created, not discovered but forged. And in this recognition lies a freedom so profound it feels almost unbearable. For if the world will not protect goodness, then we must become its protectors. If the world will not honor fairness, then we must become its living testimony. If the world will not provide justice, then we must embody it in the way we live, love, and suffer. And though this may not end wars, heal diseases, or prevent accidents, it does something even more radical. It turns suffering itself into the crucible of awakening, the place where despair transforms into defiance, where meaninglessness becomes the soil from which new meaning grows, where the silence of the universe becomes the backdrop against which the human voice, fragile yet unyielding, declares itself. So when you next encounter the inevitable, when the world once again betrays its own illusions and bad things come to those who least deserve them, perhaps the truest response is not to ask why, but to ask, how will I meet this? How will I carry it? How will I choose to live in a reality that refuses to be fair? And in asking this, you begin to glimpse the paradoxical gift buried within the wound, that though suffering will never be just, it can still become the ground upon which you awaken into a life of unshakable depth, where goodness is no longer a bargain with fate, but an act of pure